Wynncraft's balancing is a mess. That is a common sentiment a lot of people have been saying in the endgame community of Wynncraft. But why is that? What causes people to dislike the game's approach to its balancing so much? Well, let's discuss that briefly in this video. Disclaimer: I want to start off by saying that please do not use this video to harass anyone, and I do not condone or hold any ill will towards the item maker or the ability team. I just want this game to improve, especially since I have spent so much time and effort playing this game and working around the balance of it. Everything I say here is from a player's perspective of looking at things. I have also added timestamps so you can skip directly to the part of the video you are more interested in. This video is a way for me to start a discussion about the current state of the game without getting into an argument with team members who do not like their balance change being questioned. And hopefully also for someone who has the ability to make changes in Wynncraft team to see this and do something about the issues that I will bring up. Introduction and explaining balance patches. Wynncraft has been introducing a lot of free balancing in its recent patches, which have shifted to a bi-weekly structure. By the time I'm recording this, there might be a pause though. However, a lot of these changes in these patches have been focused on nerfing items that are powerful or playstyle that are used too much, or as some people call it, the meta. Now, I personally don't find issues with this if we ignore the latter part, where things are getting changed due to popularity, but let's be real. A hidden crazy mechanic is less likely to be noticed by anyone, forget just item makers, than something that everybody is using. But it doesn't mean that popular items should be nerfed all the time. Popularity is not equal to power. This is something that should be common sense, but it might as well not be at these times. However, let me explain one of the more important terms I will be using in this video before we continue. Balance team, and I quote. Now, when I say balance team, I mean both the item maker and the ability team. There's also the mob balance team, however, they're not suffering from these issues as much. However, speaking of item team and ability team, there is one big problem that needs to be discussed about that first. The separation between AT and IMs. Wynncraft has two major systems for approaching its balance, the items and the ability tree. Now, in any normal game, there would be a unified balance team working on both the systems simultaneously. However, Wynncraft does not take this approach. Wynncraft separates its balance team into two different groups, the item makers and the recently formed ability team. Now, the issue here is that based on the responses to the complaints about balance, when asked to improve a certain aspect of it, we are told that there is not a lot either the item or the ability team can do about one or the other. Sometimes the changes done can feel disjointed and give the effect that they hardly coordinate with each other when balancing their respective fields based on the changes. Now, why would that be a problem? Well, it creates a rift between balancing, where sometimes the ability tree can make weak items strong, and sometimes an ability tree entirely can be held together by a single item being good. Hanafubuki Labyrinth. Now, this sentiment has been repeated by a lot of item makers that they can't really do much about items being bad when the class or the tree does not support it, or the design itself is not that great. Albeit, I feel like this is an excuse, since you can rebalance the item entirely, do not rely on the tree as much. But I do understand the concern, because we have to remember that the ability tree generally also takes more dev time. But I genuinely believe that if the two teams were more coordinated when creating new things, this issue would not exist as much as it does. Alright, let me give an example for this. When the item, the Shaman Relic, lore, was buffed by the IMs, due to its interaction with the archetype Ritualist, this ended up actually causing an uproar where people did not like an item that allowed an archetype to thrive because it instantly activate awakened, to become much worse compared to its previous state. Now, this is one example of many issues caused by the rift between the item design and the ability design in Wynncraft. There are even more examples such as Trance before like buffed Labyrinth, like before it got buffed, and many, many more. I do want to preface everything I say here is from a player's perspective of looking and based on the changes we have seen in the past, right? Genuinely, the item and the abilities are both well mixed, and neither the ability team nor the item team should use one or the other to excuse lack of balancing or issues to persist. Now, what do I mean by this? In a lot of cases, when someone points out that an issue exists with, let's say, a weapon, it can get shut down by saying it's an ability tree issue where it's not supported by it. That would not be the case if there was better communication between the teams, in which case the item makers would then approach the ability team and ask how they can improve the state of said weapon when making the weapon, in terms of both the ability design and the item design. Instead of saying something like, the weapon is not our problem, go bother the ability team. But despite all that, I've been told there is much better coordination as of recent, but we will have to see based on future patches and how they play out. However, when abilities or items are designed by one team without directly consulting the other, that is not healthy in the long scheme of things. Even if these excuses are valid, they wouldn't be a problem if Wynncraft had a little better management when it came to item team and the ability team. Speaking of which, Wynncraft balance and community management needs improvement. Now, the thing about item makers and ability team not being that coordinated is that I don't really blame either of the members in the teams for this issue. Because there isn't really anything they can do about it, but there is one group of people who can and should have been working on making this better: the management behind the teams. From what I heard, the item team is mainly autonomous, they work on their own, but the ability team does have proper management behind it. So, why haven't they been making the ability team coordinate with item makers when discussing balance repercussions of any new ability or any ability change in general, which is so intertwined with the items and core balance of Wynn? An example of this would be how Eldritch Call in its entirety was handled at launch and how it affects an existing item which was perfectly fine at the time, which is Resonance. Well, I'll state my honest opinion here. I think Wynncraft's balance and community management is a mess in general. Not just because of the ability team and item team's lack of deep coordination that is expected, but also because of the other aspects of the game balance, such as mob balancing, where sometimes the mobs can be balanced with mythic levels of powers in mind, then all of a sudden every mythic weapon gets nerfed, and also community interactions about managing. There I've seen a lot of managers who have lost their temper over angry people in the community, or just harsh criticism, or have gotten extremely stressed out due to people being angry in general. Now, getting upset over someone being angry is a valid response for a human being. But the issue here is, for managing a large community such as Wynncraft, the management should be able to handle all sorts of people. This comes under the very basic yet advanced skill set of management, especially community management. Now, the issue I have seen with how Wynn hires managers is that most of the managers I have seen were hardworking content team individuals who had put a lot of merit into their work and had a lot of talent in content creation. However, management is a completely different skill set that you cannot gain on your own. There's a whole ass degree for it. Management requires you to have a really good leadership skill, be able to handle stress really well, and never lose your temper or cool under any situation. From my experience with seeing how Win community and management has gone, the latter half cannot be considered true, and based on how item makers and ability team have been coordinated, the former half cannot be true either. However, I do want to preface something, is that I have heard that in a lot of other fields in Wynncraft, internally, the management is awesome, it's great, but the point I am trying to make here is that the balance and understanding the community standards of balance is definitely not up to the pace I'd expect from the management. I do want to also preface something that please understand. I have nothing against any manager in particular. I think everybody in Wynncraft's management side of things is a great person and a great and talented individual in terms of content creation as well. It's just that Wynncraft needs to hire or look for people who are more well versed with the difficult skill set that is management instead of relying on volunteers who have shown a lot of great work in the fields they are working in. As per community management, I have to unfortunately say that it is in a condition where you could just say it doesn't even exist. There is a clear lack of management who can understand and assess the sentiment of the players well enough, along with feedback management and community handling. I genuinely wish that the current state of community management is looked at, because if it was fine, I would not have to make this video in the first place at all. Okay, now let's go back to discussing the balance team again. This time, I want to discuss item makers now. Item maker interactions are not the greatest thing ever. Item makers are the most active branch of Wynncraft content team when it comes to interacting with the community. But are these interactions good? No, not exactly, not always. A lot of item makers get in through a selection process that checks how well they can design items and how well they understand the item design philosophy, meaning that they are generally more adept at understanding items than the general player due to this, right? Well, yeah, but that doesn't give them an excuse to have a holier than thou approach when discussing items and balance either. What do I mean by this exactly? Basically, a lot of times, item makers get into discussions with the general community about item philosophy and balance. Now, these discussions can go two ways. It's a relaxed discussion where they try and understand the philosophy behind the item and how it's designed, or the person they're interacting with does not like the item and are objecting to its design. However, that same person may not be completely well versed in class building or item design, so the best they can really do is create an idea of how they feel. In the latter half of the scenarios, the item makers do have a greater understanding of the design since, well, they made the item, which in turn kinda ends up in situations where they can act very condescending towards people who do not completely understand their design. This can often be observed in channels like Ask IMs. Item makers are still public figures that represent the team, and especially the balance team. Saying things like, quote unquote, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or just being very condescending in general, does not create a good image on how people think of the team. Time and time again, we have seen a lot of people in the team put themselves on a pedestal and end up being really rude to a lot of people. Hell, there are even particular videos made just to show this sort of behavior in itself only through showing screenshots. Those videos merely served as a mirror, but the reactions to those videos from the same individuals were not the greatest, albeit understandably so though, since they were kind of being called out after all. Now I do wish there were less situations like this, and I hope this video at least helps the people who are in charge of these team to do something about this sort of behavior that occurs more often than it should. However, this is going to be important. There are also instances where item makers are victim of harassment over negative reception of their changes. I do not want to neglect and shut down the actual harassment they face, because trust me, they face a lot of harassment. My issue becomes when they use this existing harassment as a cover for shutting down harsh criticism. There is a clear difference between harsh criticism and harassment. The line I personally draw is when criticism is less about the items and more about the person, but that's more of a personal take of mine. Overall, I don't think that victim mentality should be used to shut down harsh criticisms, as that discourages people from being critical about the game balance by guilting them into thinking that they are wrong for calling something bad or horrible. I hope if there are any managers watching this video, they at least do something about this behavior as well that's shown in public, because overall, this just creates a bad environment overall in the game. But why do people disagree with item makers so much in the first place though? A lot of item makers are from a previous era in Wynncraft. A lot of item makers stem from a previous era in Wynncraft where the ability tree was not a feature. And when people wanted to run unique builds in different styles, they would run things like hybrid builds and poison builds. And the items at the time supported that. However, as the ability tree was introduced, a lot of these older styles of building phased out of the game's meta and popularity in general. Most of the playstyles differ now and vary not because of items, but because of the ability tree. The items in Wynncraft are unfortunately no longer the integral part of what defines a build completely. Like, back in the day, we used to have item archetypes like WFA and TWF that defined a build. But now the main factor is the ability tree. This does not mean that the items are completely useless. This just means that they're now used to further boost the tree's output, and the builds are now catered to tree archetypes and are called things like upper screen builds or arcanist builds, for example. Now, what was that entire tangent about the ability tree and items? It was to explain how the class building has changed after 2.0 and how the scene has changed. But nowadays, there are still plenty of items as the new melee items that still get designed with older things in mind, or items that are not rebalanced due to how older system weighed stats. However, this is not the case for every item, keep in mind. There are great outliers, such as the new Annihilation Mythics, but there are still items that are not rebalanced due to how older system valued stats like melee damage, poison, mana steal, etc., which have now become less important in the current landscape of building. Some items to show as an example of this issue would be Galleon, Inferno, and many more. Due to this, a lot of discussions that are held between the older item makers, or item makers from circles of older class builders, and the general player base can have a disconnect in what's good and what's not, which leads to the entire toxic interactions that I discussed in the previous section of the video. However, I do think that being acceptable to change in the current meta would be healthier, and acceptance that some playstyles are just long gone and maybe they don't need to be forced to stay alive is a good thing. However, that is more so a personal take of mine and should be taken with a grain of salt. Then there are also some balanced team members who play older builds or are generally not up to date with the current endgame, but they claim to be part of the endgame tryhard community to justify their takes. However, when they share their opinions, it seems completely out of touch from the actual opinions of people who actively grind the game. And claiming to be an endgame player who understands the current landscape and doing less than 10 raids a week comes off as someone who's just lying for respect from others. While I understand why someone would want to do this, from talking about this with a lot of people who actively grind the game and the endgame, these takes usually come off as really detached and generally invalidate the amount of time people put into the game. Think of it like this: it's like someone who never grew up in poverty started saying that they grew up in the hood. Now, how would that make people who have actually gone through struggle feel? I believe there is nothing wrong with playing older builds or off meta builds, but using off meta reasonings deal with the concern of the general endgame player should be avoided, as that invalidates both the efforts of players who spend hours playing this game and the feedback that they give. Honestly, this and the last section is caused by me seeing how bitter the community and the item makers have become over the last few months. And I am tired of arguing with others, seeing arguments and just the hostility that has developed in the community. And I genuinely wish this could just stop, man. But why has the community become this way? The gatekeeping culture in Wynncraft. Wynncraft community has been devolving for a long time. After all this talk about me pointing out the issues with the balance team, I want to also shine some light on the way the community has been acting since the update 2.0, if I'm being honest. This was an issue in 1.20, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't as big of an issue as it has become now. What issue am I talking about? The rise of elitist culture in Wynncraft and the gatekeeping that comes with it. Or perhaps it's the other way around. That is, the elitist culture that's caused by the gatekeeping in Wynncraft. First, let me explain what I mean by gatekeeping exactly, because I'd like to make my definition of this very widely used term in Wynncraft very clear. Gatekeeping in Wynncraft refers to hiding mechanics, trees, builds, or any information from the public and keeping it available only to a close group of people. There is a lot more to this, but this is the general way I define gatekeeping. There's also gatekeeping exploits or keeping those secret, but I do not put those under this discussion because I consider that just rule breaking in general, and discussing that kind of gatekeeping will not be healthy for this discussion. So, enough of explaining this, let's get into actual meat and potatoes of the discussion. Why do people gatekeep in Wynncraft? Contrary to popular belief, there is a lot of nuance behind this, and it's not as simple as quote unquote don't want stuff nerfed. One of the first reasons for gatekeeping in Wynncraft community is caused by the competitive nature of raids nowadays, which is such a weird thing in my opinion. Since raids are more so a player versus entity content, so why are they becoming competitive? Well, Wynncraft has leaderboards, doesn't it? To stay in the leaderboards, people gatekeep optimization behind raids, builds, and techniques needed to do raids quickly. Now, nothing can really change this culture of gatekeeping, unfortunately. Even removing leaderboards would likely not change the mentality, as it's already set in stone. But this is a very small minority of the reasons people actually gatekeep as well. So that's all I really have to say about this. Now, the second reason players gatekeep is a little more quirky. They just do it to avoid their personal builds from getting too popular. Now, why is that? I will go a bit more over in the third reason, but most of the time they do just dislike their personal work and their build becoming mainstream. However, this is the smallest minority amongst the gatekeeping community in Wynncraft. But the third and the biggest reason people have created this gatekeeping culture is because they're afraid of their builds getting nerfed. Let's understand why, though. First up, it is a common trend that meta and overused items are more likely to be nerfed in comparison to underused or not so popular items, with Warp as a perfect example for this. What this ends up creating is a feeling that if your build or your item becomes popular to the point that everybody is using it, it is more likely to get nerfed. Is this objectively true? Likely not. But popular items are generally also good items, and if something is good and popular at the same time, then it's more likely to be noticed by someone who is in charge of balancing. So popularity is a factor in balancing, but it's not the only factor. Unfortunately though, with the pattern that the patches follow, where it's largely popular items getting nerfed over and over and over again, and meta playstyles getting disabled, such as Battle Monk, the community has gotten much more distrustful of the balance team, as they're afraid that their builds can easily get nerfed, and in turn they end up gatekeeping. This is not healthy at all. Whether it's true or not, the pattern that has been followed where something becomes popular then gets nerfed has created the sentiment in the community that they must keep their builds hidden from the public and make sure optimal builds or meta builds are kept hidden from the public as well, and that even leads to harassment of people who publicize builds to help others. This sort of an environment in the community also leads to harsher criticism in feedback, which leads to item makers and ability team having to struggle more with dealing with this. Which brings me to my next point. The balance team cannot handle feedback well. There are a few issues with this that I want to bring up overall. But let's take it one step at a time, for the sake of not overwhelming ourselves with different issues. But before I do that, I want to give a disclaimer. A lot of these points are actually displayed by select few individuals that just overall ends up reflecting badly on the whole team in general. But I still believe this should be brought up and discussed so either those individuals can stop or are handled by people who are in charge of handling community interactions. First up is a general fact that a lot of balance team members get into feedback discussions with a closed mind. That is, they don't want you to think that they might not always be in the right when it comes to discussing items. What do I mean by this? Basically, in a lot of discussions, A lot of content team join in without wanting to admit that they might be wrong or someone's criticism may be valid. Since a lot of balance change is done by a single individual, the person who spearheads the change is the same person who goes into discussions when someone gives feedback about it. And the same individual may end up not wanting to admit that their design might not be perfect or might have flaws to it. This ends up with them becoming really defensive about their items. And instead of going into feedback discussions with an open mind and wanting to see how other people think and what they can do better, they end up going into discussions while thinking it's some sort of a challenge to see how well they can defend their design. A lot of these individuals tend to get offended over extremely harsh criticism very easily and can often confuse any feedback about balance changes or any changes in particular as insults to them. And this ends up causing an unhealthy situation more often than what should be normal. And then there's also people who claim that some team members just completely refuse to listen to feedback and ignore everything someone says about balance. This is a common complaint. I sort of see why people believe this, but there's actually more nuance to this than meets the eye. This is actually a rather better approach in my personal opinion than going in guns blazing into feedback, wanting to start arguments. But ignoring feedback is not what's always going on. A lot of time, feedback is already acknowledged and noted, but Wynncraft has limited dev time. Now, what is dev time? Everything in terms of ability tree and major IDs in Wynncraft require a developer to code the changes, and this requires time. So the time needed to make the changes is called dev time. Now there are things higher up in said dev time priority to be changed. Now that is the reason that's generally given on why important changes are either brushed off or frequently take so long to be implemented. The keyword here is priority. But there is caveat here. Priority should not be used as an excuse to let egregious things in terms of balance just remain. Because as I earlier said, things higher in priority are changed first. Now my issue is, why are smaller tweaks and non-major changes generally in higher priority over bigger and more important changes? What do I mean by this? Let me explain with some examples. Boltslinger and Battlemonk have been objectively horrible over the past few months, and whenever someone requests for a buff, it gets brushed aside with the excuse that Shaman and Assassin changes right now are higher on the priority. Now the issue with this is that priority then is completely wrong, because as the way they are, Assassin and Shaman have been more well balanced and playable than something like Battlemonk for a decent amount of patches now. And the balance team is still delaying a major rebalance for such a weak archetype. What kind of priority is it where tweaks to a rebalanced archetype by just adjusting tentacle damage every few often is higher priority than fixing a fundamentally weak and unplayable mess of an archetype? This is why priority, I believe, is not always a valid excuse, because it's not always allocated correctly in the first place. In my personal opinion, all the major rebalances should be done first to create a very stable and very varied environment to play every archetype in. And then tweaks can be done either simultaneously or after the major rebalances, at least to fix the extremely broken or extremely weak stuff, and then focus on maintaining a balance. There's also an excuse I brought up way earlier in the video when discussing feedback, where item makers can use the ability tree as a reason to excuse bad balancing for an item that's reliant on an ability tree to perform well. Even if it's not reliant, they can still use it as an excuse. And then there's also many other commonly used excuses. Valid or not, the issue I am trying to highlight is the need to defend items in the first place when discussing feedback for it. That is, a culture where criticism and feedback is met with just defensive responses instead of healthy discussion is not a good place. And I believe a lot of issues previously discussed with the balance team will need to be addressed alongside some PR training. Because in the end, Having these sorts of interactions and this sort of an approach towards feedback is not healthy for any game, not just Wynncraft, where people go in to give feedback with an open mind and are met with harsh response from defensive members of the balance team. Then these same people are more wary and negatively biased the next time they give feedback, which causes the balance team to become even more defensive, and this ends up creating a negative loop of going back and forth and arguing, which leads us to the situation we are in today. Now let's see how the community feels as well. While making this video, I reached out to a lot of active endgame player based communities who are generally well versed in what's good and what's not to see what they think of the current state of balancing. I asked 3 questions and got over 50 responses from people who are playing the game actively. The responses range from being optimistic and positive to downright tired of the game and everything it stands for. So, I will try to sum up the opinion of these people as best as I can. I want to apologize in advance if I end up not conveying your response perfectly, but I will try my best. The 3 questions I asked were, and I'm going to exactly quote the questions I asked. The first question was, quote unquote, how do you feel about the bi-weekly changes in Wynncraft? End quote. The second question was, start the quote, how do you feel about the way Wynncraft balances things and how things are balanced right now? End quote. And the third question, as I covered previously, was, how do you feel about how the item makers and the ability team handle feedback and suggestions about balancing? End quote. Now, based on the responses, we will now learn what the general endgame community also feels about these changes to get an even better insight on the state of balancing. Because just me rambling on and on and on and on is not going to be the most productive this video can get. So let's start with the first question. How do you feel about the bi-weekly balance changes in Wynn? After asking this question, the answers were the most varied with this, so let's go over the positive responses first. I do want to emphasize this. The answers here are based on what people said after being asked about these changes. These are more so to show the actual sentiment of the people about this rather than to say what's objectively right or wrong. This is to highlight sentiment again. Sentiment. The good is that people love the frequency of the updates and that it shows that Wynncraft team is always up to date with their content. It keeps the things fresh and gives people something to look forward to every 2 weeks. Although I will explain later that that's not always a good thing. People did say that they enjoy the bug fixes and the quality of life fixes and overall changes towards content like raids, loot runs, and the fact that they can work on bi-weekly changes while also working on major updates like Fruma is a great indicator of how the content team care about the health of the game this aged. Changes and patches overall are great, and the general player who is not fully endgame focused isn't affected that much either. These are much better than the previous standard of one patch every 6 to 12 months than almost complete drought. More updates is always good for content that doesn't apply to balance only, such as aesthetic features like builds, bug fixes, music, models, but we will get to balancing in a bit. Overall, the consistency is healthy and good for the game in the long term, and we can look at some server like Monumenta as an example of these bi-weekly or even weekly patches done perfectly. And hopefully Wynncraft can also reach that level of effectiveness. But let's go over the bad now. Despite the good the bi-weekly patches can do, this doesn't mean that they're done right. These bi-weekly patches, despite the great premise, are a complete mess in terms of balancing and execution. Most of the big balance changes you see in these patches are small rebalances to minor items that end up looking like filler most of the time, especially since these don't affect the more consistent player base, that is, the endgame player base. I don't personally see how 50 rebalanced for a level 20 to 30 item is generally a great use of time and effort, especially when they're already adequate enough, and there's more important items that need a rebalance. Basically, a lot of these changes feel like quantity over quality, where there's just a lot of unnecessary changes that are untested or not assessed properly. and can cause even negative impact on the community, which brings me to my next point. The ugly. The bloat is not the biggest issue with bi-weekly patches. They are bad. They can be unpolished, but they are not the worst. There is a problem that a lot of players in the Wynncraft community have been bringing up with these patches. The focus of these patches have mainly been nerfs. Now, normally a few nerfs in a while is not a bad thing. There are always things that can end up being outrageous in the meta, and they need to be put down. But every single bi-weekly patch being bloated with nerfs everywhere you see, that sets a really bad standard and pretense for the approach the balance team has been taking for how they handle the meta and popularity of items overall. These changes in nerfs are quite often reactionary to what is currently popular, as explained with examples in the previous section, making it feel like the balance team is changing things for the sake of changing things and removing everything that becomes popular. Now, a lot of the team might disagree on this, but the entire point people make about quote unquote nerfing fun from the game generally does stem from the evidence of this happening so many times, ranging from things like removing cherry bombs, removing bash cream, Battlemon getting a big nerf with discombobulate, countless nerfs to popular items, and aspect changes such as removing off the entire playstyle that is Bolt Slinger being effective by killing off the bouncing bomb aspect as well, and much, much, much more. People, due to this, are much more cautious now and much wary of these bi weekly patches and are worried about their builds getting gutted more than half the time. While there are people who look forward to rebuilding items and trying out new things, you have to remember that for the general player base, these so frequent nerfs are nothing more than their favorite playstyle being removed every 2 weeks. A lot of balance changes seem to have been nerfing things for the sake of nerfs, and overall bi-weekly patches are not bad, but these have just not been executed right, and end up feeling like whack-a-mole with popular builds more than half the time. I believe it buffs could be there to bring the extremely weaker items, such as Gaia, Inferno, Toxo, up the power level, at the same time as bringing overpowered items down the power level as nerfs, so the community wouldn't feel this way, we would be in a much better situation. But it is now how balancing is being handled. Which brings me to the second question I asked. How do you feel about the way Wynn balances things and how things are balanced right now? Like my previous section, I will take a step by step approach on explaining what the community sentiment is about this. So let's start with the good, shall we? The balance changes do keep the class building scene very alive by constantly changing what's good, albeit by just making the good things become bad. But it's still useful for keeping things fresh. The frequent nerfs don't really affect the non-class building player that much either, as they usually just need to find a new build and switch to if their build breaks, and they just use whatever they are told is good. Some players even like the lower difference between the level of DPS you can achieve. However, there has been sentiments that they dislike how roles such as support or tanks are not being rebalanced completely, but that's a different issue. There are always nice changes that should be appreciated, and sometimes, despite being devastating, these nerfs and these changes can also be necessary evil to squash down the extremely overpowered stuff. And according to some people, a longer boss fight due to extreme lowering DPS standard is not a bad thing. I want to be honest with every answer I was given, by the way. So even if I disagree with some takes, I will still mention this in this video, okay? So, continuing on, there's one more good thing that I think was not said enough. That is, the pre-nerf stage of the meta was very unbalanced as well, where some builds, like Fallen for example, were so strong that it could kill a boss in less than 10 seconds. I am not joking when I say that. So this is a personal take, yes, but this is a community section and it feels wrong to add a personal take here, I'm not gonna lie. But I still feel like this needs to be stated and emphasized that nerfing overpowered items is good. It is not wrong to do so either, and it stops people from just ignoring boss mechanics and mob design by dealing too much damage. But that being said, Let's go on to the bad of the balancing. There's a counterproductive nature of balance where balance doesn't reflect the preference of the general player base, and it can create situations where the balance doesn't completely reflect on how it will actually affect a player who generally does not play the same builds as the people behind these rebalances. Overall, more contenti members need to engage with the community to understand what's actually good or bad and what needs changing a little better. If everything is decided by a select individuals and they don't have a complete understanding of the scene, then the result will mostly be individualistic changes that come off more disconnected than actually being valid. Now, a lot of these balance changes are also untested and are not experienced properly first hand from a player's perspective. Sometimes even feeling like these changes, I've said this so much time that these changes feel like they're done for the sake of changing, but like the point here is that they needed to be tested properly. And there are some people in the team who do understand the perspective of the players. They are doing a great job. But there are also outliers who refuse to do so and even be dishonest or disillusioned about their understanding of a player's perspective. There's also a lot of bloat being rebalanced, which is not that useful in the larger scale of things. I am looking at you right now, Poison Rebalancing. Weaker items are also buffed so insignificantly that it does not change how many people actually play it in the first place. If power creep is used as a reason on why the buffs are not enough, what will the power creep be in at least making the weaker items perform at a baseline that's not too egregiously lower than the one accepted by the community, at least? Now, the thing about these nerfs is that it's to nerf the upper damage ceiling that you can get so that you can have more skill expression by using not so optimal builds. However, there's an oxymoron here. Nerfing skill ceiling does not increase the skill expression outside of very particular and niche builds that were never great to begin with. As you'd want the ceiling to be high for players who are willing to play builds which are extremely hyperglass, extremely risky, but the damage nerfs to these specific hyperglass and risky builds don't seem to reflect that sentiment. People will always feel bad about their items being nerfed, by the way, especially when it happens every patch. Believe it or not, people do not enjoy having to start anew so often and so frequently, and more so having to rebuild everything they've made from scratch because all of a sudden the changes made their build perform worse than a social studies major trying to give a coding exam. Now, on to the ugly. If you thought we were done, there's a high chance you haven't been active in the endgame player base and haven't discussed how they feel about balance. Because, oh boy, there's so much to cover. A lot of older items are left unbuffed and extremely weak after armor pieces or accessories get nerfed. In an ideal world, everything should be viable by community standards of what is good. It is unhealthy how the balance team is still afraid of buffing older items in the fear that it might create power creep, even though buffing older items is a better approach to create more variety on what players use. And coming back to the topic of nerfs, sometimes the rebalance can be so badly done that it just kills off an entire class or makes an entire playstyle not viable. Further expanding on why testing is important. I've given examples previously, such as Archer or Battle Monk, but there's also instances like War builds catching strays as well whenever something like mana potions get nerfed, although it's more rare to find Warring not catch stray bullets when any rebalance is done in Wynncraft. And now the neglect of Warring is a whole other can of worms I am not qualified enough to talk about yet, and don't want to get into either. Sometimes the nerfs are even inconsistent and all over the place from a general player's perspective. Because one day you are nerfing Hero, and the next day you are nerfing Ignis. Now, the reason that was given behind Ignis nerf was that it was an extremely defensive item that gave good damage for the utility it had. But the issue is, this sort of shows an example of the disconnect between the balance team and the player base, because it seems they don't realize that defensiveness is not factored as much as damage is for builds in the current meta of the endgame players. And lastly, there is almost no regard for how mobs and bosses will interact with the items after the items get rebalanced and the abilities get rebalanced. Whether people like to admit or not, mob balance is also closely linked to balance in general. And while Wynn's mob design is really good and commendable, awesome even after 2.1, the item and ability teams seem to not be able to keep up with the consistent baseline that the bosses follow in terms of quality, and sometimes even change the power level to be significantly weaker to the point where it's unable to clear properly. Again, I am looking at Battle Monk right now and how it was handled with Discombobulate and Bolt Slinger with the aspect as an example here, where the nerfs made them deal so little damage that it cannot really clear content that well anymore. This kind of sums up the answers I got about the state of balancing. Which, by the way, I want to say that this is all, not of all of this is my opinion. I asked people for their opinions as well, so just want to make that clear. Which brings me to the last question I asked. How do you feel about how the balance team handle feedback and suggestions about balancing? Now, for most of these answers, they were extremely similar to the points I have already covered previously, but there were some points that I'd like to bring up that someone else brought up that I have missed. Some positive things were said, where people mentioned that interacting with the community is a good thing. So is transparency, by the way. Radio silence is not the answer to the issues that we face due to certain individuals and how they deal with feedback. Rather, action should be taken against the outliers and not the general team. If I had to interject and give my personal opinion here, I genuinely agree with this, and I love how awesomely interactive the general content team members are, with the exception of the outliers, whose actions I discussed previously. However, a lot of response did emphasize that feedback needs to be heard a bit more and considered more as well, because the game is not just played by the few players who make it, but by everybody who plays the game, and everybody wants their voices heard. Sort of the reason I added this entire section to the questionnaire as well. Some answers gave suggestions on things where the quality assurance of the game can be significantly improved by verifying suggestions from people outside of the team to avoid situations where changes are made based on the opinion of two or three people instead of the general audience. Overall, the way some team members handle feedback is extremely bad, but it is still better than some mainstream games, so that should be addressed as well. One more thing I should mention is that people appreciate dev notes and changelogs and reasoning behind changes. That trend, please continue that. That is awesome. But despite these positive comments that I highlighted here, I do want to re emphasize the negative parts of how the feedback is handled as well, because as I stated previously, there is a lot of aggression, excuses, defensiveness, and overall bad practice that takes place when people have to deal with critical feedback. So that ends the three questions I asked everyone, but brings us to the bigger question. What can even be done to improve the current state of balance in the game? Well, I will be covering different suggestions I had in mind to improve the state of balance and the team behind it, alongside how the community is handled in Wynn as a whole. Let's start with the balance aspects first. Please, please just put the trigger happy nerfing mindset to rest. Understand that balancing involves buffing weaker items to an equal extent as nerfing stronger items. Perhaps a baseline of what's considered goofed should be made and buff things up to that baseline to avoid power creep. Not more, not less. And reduce the quantity of these rebalance and improve the quality by adding more testing, more feedback loops, which don't end up in hostility, might I add, and be more open to what other people think. Because despite being well versed, in item designing, does not mean you are correct every time. Please understand that. Then, more on the quality side of balancing. Please consider the current landscape of the endgame player base more when rebalancing things. When I say this, I do not want any individual to give a blanket statement like, I know what I'm doing. That shows and proves nothing. In reality, that same person might say very out of touch things that proves their entire statement is more wrong than it is right. Instead, please just consult anyone who has some decent activity in the endgame content of Wynncraft and is active in the class building scene at the moment. Not somebody who used to be active, but stop making builds cater to the modern landscape of Wynn. Now, the next few messages is to the managers or anyone in some authority in Wynncraft watching this video. Please do not take my request too lightly, as I firmly believe that these stem from just genuine negative experience from both me and the many people I consulted while making this video. There are certain individuals in the team who can react very negatively to community interaction and feedback. This is not healthy for the game, and I explain the type of interactions that might occur as well. In most cases, they end up in a really bitter situation with the person they might be arguing with, or just worsen the image for the team as a whole. Please handle these outliers in any way fit or possible, or reduce the interaction they have with the community, as I am personally tired of this negative cycle and negative loop that has been occurring in Win for so long, too long even. I genuinely hope this message has some sort of an impact and is not just brushed off as silly endgame meta tryhard rambling about feedback not being considered. Please. Then more so, please give better public response training to the team members who are not well versed with dealing with negative feedback, harsh criticism, or just a toxic community. Because based on their reaction, they can end up putting fuel to the fire that is how people see the content team. I have many friends in the team itself who have gotten harassed due to some individuals not knowing how to correctly interact with, let's say, an angry mob or upset players. I understand that this is a voluntary position, but even in voluntary spaces, it is expected that the volunteers either don't mess up their public relations and interactions, or just avoid interacting if they cannot help themselves. And if any team member who ends up in bad situations is watching this video, instead of arguing or trying to respond to the feedback I gave, just have some basic guidelines to follow, or just avoid interacting in general, because more often or than not, your interactions may cause way more harm than they cause good for the community, and the Win community is not doing well right now, and I just want things to get better. Closing thoughts. I just wanna say that this video is largely stemmed from my discontent with how win balancing has been approached for a long time. This has been sitting at the back of my mind for so long that I felt like I needed to get what I feel like out before I ended up saying something I would regret instead. I feel like this is a healthier way for me to approach my discontent as well. I do want to say again though, I hold no ill will towards anyone in particular. I just genuinely dislike being in a community that has devolved to a state like this, and I genuinely hope that there are improvements soon. I also want to apologize if anyone watching this video might have been offended. I did not mean to offend or attack anybody in particular. I just wanted to highlight some issues and call out certain behavior. Then I want to mention that this is a feedback video. I am not in the mood or the right state of mind to argue whether you agree with every take or not. If you don't agree with some of the takes here, that is fine. Everyone in Wynncraft has their own experience playing the game, and no one's experience or opinion is the same. There is no right or wrong, just issues, solutions, and opinions. So let's keep the discussion healthy and constructive in not only the comment section of this video, but also the forums and the Discord. Because remember that despite everything I said about team not handling communication well, we as a community also have to do our part in making the interactions better and improve the overall state of the game. Because Wynncraft needs to, if you want to make Wynncraft a better place, it is not the sole responsibility of its devs, but also the players who play it. And lastly, I want to thank everybody who helped me with this video. If they asked me, I will leave credits in the description, and more importantly, please remember to like and subscribe to help the silly Cooper get media rank and give me some motivation to make content. That entire shill aside, thank you for sticking for so long. watching the entire rant video. Oh my god, this must have been so long. I wrote this. I was not expecting this script to be so long. All right, I'm going off script now, and like, oh my god, jeez. I hope like this I don't get clowned on for like just sharing my opinions, because in the end I just I know that some people might not agree. It's like it's just I wanted to talk about this, right? So enough of me rambling again. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.